Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon, co-author with Peter Vale of the digital book on Practice as a Way of Being. Find it at mylibrary.world. And now to our show. I like Tenneson Woolf. What a very pleasant person to spend 30 minutes or so with in this conversation. I think you'll share that feeling. He's just well in touch with his heart and soul, and has a very keen and active mind, and all of that works at once when you're talking with him about his work and what he puts into it and what comes out of it, which in this case, we're talking about facilitating a group, a team, to help them move forward and arrive in a better place. Tenneson can make that happen. So here he is. See what I mean? When I said hello to my friend Tenneson Woolf, I said, now is my turn to get back at you. Well, that was being a wise ass, but I had a lovely time on his podcast. And so now you're going to hear us talking a bit about each other and what it is to be in our sort of practice. What is his practice? Well, I've known him as a poet, an author, a consultant, and a very effective facilitator of group involved change. So that's a nice way to be. Tenneson, what do you remember about our podcast session? What pops into the top of your mind?
Well, hi, Dave. Thanks, first of all. That's great. I'm happy to follow that kind of prompt, actually, because I remember you talking about your days at the YMCA, I think it was, and your swimming days. And
That's
you
right.
mentioned that just a little before we started recording here. So there was something to me that I remember of the context for talking, because you've lived some years and done some things.
I have.
But I kind of like the way that you anchored it in some story that was part of your growing and forming and, figuring out who you were, stuff like that. That's
it was the shallow end, deep end metaphor, which does come up from time to time. And I think it is telling, really, of the work we both do as people. I, for many years as a teacher, and now more as a podcaster, writer, et cetera. I think there's a lot of deep end out there wherever you turn, and rather dark waters sometime, and reason for people to be very concerned. I recorded and just put out a podcast I had with two good, well thought people, like who's really their work, their practice is to observe trends and make sense and then advise leaders. And I was surprised, because their study that they just did and reported on was how pessimistic the 1,200 people they sampled were about the future, and sort of angry that things weren't changing all the way out globally, but that frustration. One of the two, Tom, is close to my age and just turned 74. And the other, Lizzie, is someone who is a wonderful marketer, lives in New Orleans, very socially conscious. And so I had the two sort of generations talking. Tom and I were going on and on, as we do. And the clip I put up there was Lizzie goes, "I'm shocked that you find that rage is a factor in the study." She said, "Rage is actually good." And I was like, "What?" She said, "I'm speaking as a millennial, but until you feel rage, you don't want to work for change. You you being society and you,
Right.
particularly your age group. So back to the pool again, real quickly. Uh, I think in a way that uh, you and I preach and serve with love, but the word rage came up and in this, and I wonder what that does to you as such a sensitive person to hear me talking about
Uh,
rage.
there you go. Yeah, well, I'll share a little bit, Dave. I think the way that I hear that kind of question is in my brain, it kind of shows up as what's some of the relationship that I have with rage? And I hear it that way, I think, because it creates some room. And there is a part of me that probably fears rage,
Oh,
uh, that kind of intensity, or maybe stuff that I just don't know what to do with. And I think, as is true, this might go into it deep fast, but there's always the layers for me, Dave, of what is the inner and then what is the outer.
yeah, I'd
And
like to
just
hear
to
about
be
it.
in relationship with our own inner means something. So, rage evokes some of those things in me that are a bit afraid or a bit concerned. Yeah, I want to take the politeness off of that. Sometimes it scares the shit out of me.
that
And
that does it
and
for
yet
me.
the person that you were talking about, I can appreciate that kind of stance also because um, I think part of the need in the world, which has probably always been true, but I'm just speaking to a version of it that I know now, is that it matters that we be in our truth telling with one another. And sometimes our truth telling is about pain, or
Yeah,
our truth telling is about injustice or oppression or just stupid, dumb systems. So, I can appreciate a range of um, experiences and, associative kinds of things that come with rage. And I don't tend to be a person that says, "Oh gosh, rage bad. Let's go away from that." But boy, if we're to be in spaces where our rage is given expression, it requires, I think, some skillful holding.
yeah,
And everything from, being a therapist, which I am not, to just, trying to do some good group process stuff so that truth telling can be
yeah,
offered. I think there's healing available in that, actually.
yeah. Well,
Wow.
to
So
be
that's
fair
big
to
topic.
Lizzie, and to your point, she went on to say,
Mm,
once you are in that state of accepting that you're really, really angry,
yeah.
then the next step is to work on a change that you can actually control. So she
Mm,
was like, focus, find something that at least you think you might be able to
mm,
deal with, and then focus and do it. And she spoke of her social and her social action in New Orleans and things, many, many things that she could focus on. And she said, "Oh, I'm picking one and I'm sticking with it."
yeah.
And coming back to
Mm,
facilitating groups now, when you walk into a group for whatever period of time,
mhm,
there are sentiments in the anger, rage, and not very pleasant
yeah.
thought that it could be below the surface. And as it happens, how do you work with that?
Yeah.
And how do they work with that with your help?
Well, that's a good question. So I'll try to pull out some of the simple that I think I rely upon, Dave, and I might test it out loud just to see if it feels like it's true.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things for me is that sort of the preamble, I think, is that I don't show up very often in a group where it's some cold call generic facilitator that's going to have us do our thing. As you know, there's a bunch of stuff that happens before that
Yeah.
that influences whether we feel like we have a fit or a chemistry or something like that, and
Mm.
whether we're aligned in purpose, and whether or not I'm the kind of person that might help them with their purpose. So I think there's a lot of stuff that precedes all of that.
Mm.
But then it's also true. Uh, I know in some of the circumstances that I'm in that people aren't necessarily choosing to be in the room, but they're told to be in the room.
Hmm.
And when they're told to be in the room, sometimes those kind of emotional states exist. And
Yeah.
it might not be rage, I'm ready to throw a chair kind of stuff, but it might be a little bit more some of the resent or passive aggressiveness, even that can show up of, I'm a busy person. I don't have time for this meeting. Why am I here?
Yeah.
Some of that kind
Looking
of
at
stuff.
the figurative
All of that,
watch,
that happens.
the body language, you can tell that
Yeah.
there's a
But one of the things that I
angst.
do with it, Dave, is often, they're paired partner conversations from the start, and I sometimes call them speed dates. And
Mm.
sometimes it's people standing up and milling about the room, and then when you say stop, make sure you have a partner, or other formats that will create those partners. And I do quick little discussions with them, little conversations. And usually I start with something like, so, and we're talking like a minute and a half each, 3 minutes total kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And the question might be, so, what's one of the things that you're excited about in
Yeah.
being here today? And then they go. And then, new partners, mingle, new partners. And then I'll play with the questions. And I'm usually going to throw something in there like, is there anything you feel nervous about or uncomfortable about in being at
Hmm.
today's meeting?
Hmm.
And I find that just by giving a little bit of expression for that or a little bit of invitation for expression, I think it changes a lot in the perception of the people that are in the room away from, oh, we're just going to bullshit with one another into, oh, wait, we could show up and tell some truth here. And that doesn't mean that we're going to fix all the problems. I'm not offering that, nor am I offering to be therapist. But I am committed as a group facilitator to try and bring some health to the circumstance or well-being or some kind of life-giving quality to the circumstance. And I think just by naming some of those qualities, it gives expression and maybe brings a little bit of health.
No, I think
I
that's a
rely on that.
fine technique, and I think that minute and that 90 seconds or however it is, with the question, what are you nervous about? By being
Yeah.
able to say that to
Yeah.
another, on a random other, rather than go around the room and everyone say something to the whole room
Yeah.
that makes you nervous. It'd be pretty soon, I think it would be, like a whole different sentiment. So what I get from this moment is the artistry
Hmm.
of preparing and then facilitating a group with the idea that at the end of that session or whatever happens additionally, there's a greater sense of group health. Now, to me, that's a lot of spontaneity
Yeah.
that is structured within a lot of experience in doing this. But if you just came in and did the drill,
Hmm.
they wouldn't get you. They would get someone doing the drill. But what I sense with you in there, as I've seen you at work in our author conversations, is you pick up on things like you just did. You'll pick
Mm-hmm.
up on it and you move it along.
Mm-hmm.
Now that I call art. What do you call
Well, I'm happy to follow that label. That feels good to me, Dave.
it?
I mean, I think you're naming something that is always in play. There is an artistry that's involved. And, the reality of artistry is we can sometimes nuance the description of what goes into the artistry, what goes into the skills or the perception and all of that. And sometimes we can't. Like sometimes I feel like we're winging it with the best of abilities that we have. But the way that you just spoke it, Dave, I relate to because I think there has to be yeah, this feels true. There has to be an underlying purpose. And you
Hmm.
just named it as what if we were trying to create a little more group health than what we started with? And even
Mhm.
that requires more conversation. That's fine. But if that's the foundation, the baseline, then the things we do, if they feed that, that can be so helpful and useful. If we come in without having some purpose baseline like that, Like I think the purpose baseline is something you exude, and that's probably part of the artistry too, Dave.
That's a good point.
But if we come without that purpose baseline, then I don't want to feel like I'm somebody's party trick or an entertainer, or it's just because I'm not skilled in that. I'm not trying to perform for people. I'm trying to create sometimes I am, that's true. But I'm trying to create more of a context where we're able to show up with one another in a way that does feel like it's honest and maybe does feel like there's an invitation for you and your artistry to come forward also. So often
Invited,
I
if
feel
you will.
like I'm
So
trying to,
feeling that invitation from
yeah,
people
well,
who,
I feel like I'm trying to hold the bigger container that is, I think we have some learning to do here on behalf of what we care about. And we have some practice to do on behalf of what we care about. We get to be in that together. So often I feel like part of my artistry, I guess, and it is for many, is that we're trying to create that context such that something life affirming might emerge out of even little things like partner conversations.
yeah, no, to me, there's a sort of a dance between the art of facilitation
Yeah,
and the technique. And
nice.
there's a lot of technique. If
Yeah,
you go out on LinkedIn or anywhere else, just oceans of technique,
yeah,
methodologies, models, and things of that nature.
yeah,
That a lot of them is published in the Collaborative Change Library, along with chapters that
yeah.
you and I've written. But looking at technique
Mm,
and not being the kind of person who can, with that in your back pocket, as Peter Vale used to call it, with technique in your back pocket, and come in with yourself and put yourself into that system and expect a certain amount of artistry and improvisation, then they don't have the same experience. You can be a wonderful technician
yeah.
and run them through exercise after exercise,
Mhm.
and everyone will go, "Oh, that was something." And then later on, they'll look at each other and say, uh, "Did you change?" No. Did you feel much? Well, it was kind of interesting. So
Mhm.
to me, that's the teacher's nightmare to go through all that, give them all my dog and pony tricks and everything, and then have them later on go. "Yeah." So what I found over all these years since I've been in the classroom, 8 years this semester, when I do reconnect, I did today with a former student by just for a chat, not for a podcast. And I said to her,
Mhm.
uh, "Well, what do you remember? I like that. I like to know. It's been 12 years since you were in my class." And
Right.
she said, "I remember you,
Yeah.
and I remember how I felt going into that classroom after coming out of some others. I look forward to it with joy."
Yeah.
And I that's it. I thought, "Oh my Lord, that's what we work for,
Yeah.
in colleges. Well, in any way that you and I are out there helping people." I'm so glad I talked her into staying, because she's a citizen now working with a major corporation, and she is in line for a federal position now that she's a citizen. And she had her interview on Friday and said, "I'll let you know how it turns out." She's also with her husband, who's from China.
Mhm.
They're taking their little girls to China for 20 days. They've earned enough money, saved enough, and they're leaving next week. Now, this is about Tenneson Woolf, but I have to tell you, I had to share that story because I think you'd appreciate
Beautiful.
transformation. We use that word a lot, don't we? But it sometimes can happen in an instant, I suspect, getting someone to drop their anger and rage or whatever is holding them in place and transforming themselves. But in some cases, you've had to work with people quite a long while, and then you start to see it. Does that ring a bell?
It does. And Dave, if I stay in your story for a moment, though, I'm one who, if someone came to me, well, I've had this happen quite a few times, but people come and they offer their version of what your student just said to you. I remember that you cared, or I remember that you were kind. I don't remember all the words you spoke, but I remember
No.
that you welcomed me, right? And I get some of that often in my places of teaching or facilitation. And I'm quite flattered by that. I'm glad that people remember a feeling.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that we're without content or without some real essential skill building, etc. But I am a human being that is somehow coded and oriented to wanting that layer of human celebration or human vulnerability, even human connection, because I think so many good things grow from there. So I'm applauding a little bit to you as the teacher that you've been over the years and just relating to it as a principle.
Yeah.
And then maybe some of what you're pointing to is, when we come into a room with people, there can be a whole range of folks that are in the room.
Mm.
And some are completely on board with everything, and some are really super stubborn and grumpy, angry that they need to be there. And then a lot that live in the middle. I think one of the things that I've learned, and maybe a way of contexting this, Dave, is a good chunk of my work in a group facilitation way will be working with a team in advance, right? What are we doing? And try to dig into purpose and some of the options and choices and how we'll go about things, some of the values, some of the principles, all of that. And um, let's see, where was I going to go with that? I lost it. I lost the train of thought.
I have that effect on people.
I know. There you go. Oh, it's the people, so some of them aren't too excited to be there. I end up relying a lot on the processes that I use. And there are, some basics and then some riffs off of the basics. But for example, I'll use a World Cafe format, the
Oh,
good
yeah.
work originally of Juanita Brown and David Isaacs and many, many others that have worked on it. But a World Cafe format, small table conversations, limited time, structured question, a few things like that. And then movement, it has a way of working the group and working the grumpies even out of the group. And I'm not talking about making it perfect or anything, but it's almost like there's a human accountability that's there, not just a knowledge accountability. And when you've got to show up at 2 or 3 or 4 small group tables, I think there's just a point where people don't tolerate you being an asshole anymore. So the process can carry a lot, right?
Yes, it
And the
does.
way that the facilitators hold it, that aren't going to sort of follow the charge of the grumpy one in the room, let's say.
I think what I'm sensing in that is that they know that
Mm.
you believe that they have a humanity as
Ooh,
well,
that's a
that
good
they
point.
have a generosity of spirit, even though it may be covered up, with a
Mhm.
tightly buttoned top button initially, but giving them the group process, but giving them and saying, I believe if you sit at this table and speak for assign them some minutes on this question, something pretty interesting,
Yeah,
maybe wonderful is going to come out. So you're saying, don't look for me for the wonderful stuff alone. I'm not a lecturer.
yeah,
I believe that you got the wonderful stuff. And if I can work this system the way I've told you I will and be
yeah.
consistent, pretty soon you might even forget that I'm in the room. And that's a great compliment, isn't
Well,
it?
let's be clear. I want everybody to think I'm brilliant, Dave.
Oh, okay.
And
Well,
I'll
I'll erase the part in the
I'll
podcast where
I'll
I
take
said
some
it.
affirmations and everything, but I think you're speaking to a truth of it, right? Like this is the premise. The old premise might have been you got to be brilliant and wow the socks off of people to have any credibility and value. And
Exactly.
I think there's a new credibility that has grown over many years now that is, oh, maybe we could, have conditions in which we get to bring out more of the wisdom that's in us as a group, something like that. So
That is.
that's where I reference not being a content expert, but I come in as someone with a little bit of process knowledge. My friend, person who was a real mentor and initial guide and has remained a long, many decades friend now, is a woman named Margaret Wheatley.
Oh
And Meg
yeah,
wrote a bunch of things, in her time, still does actually.
she
But
still does.
one of the key things that she wrote about that, caught some traction was about the difference between a leader as hero and a leader as host. And it was contrasting the very things that we're talking about right now. I
Mm-hmm.
know it all, I get it all, I'm brilliant, all of that stuff into maybe I could create formats, the host format that brings my people together so that we can, collectively be wiser together or more committed together, those things. That's a storyline and purpose line that has meant a lot to me over the years.
Yeah, and I remember a book. Oh, one of the really earlier books that she published.
Yeah.
She used the analogy of uh, now I'm having those.
There you
I'm
go.
having birch trees,
Yeah.
and I see a picture of trees behind you, so it sort of came to mind. She said, "You look at the birch trees, and they're all standing alone, and there's not much brush around them. But if you were to look under the ground, you would
Yeah.
see that they have a network
Yeah.
of roots that basically share nutrition and water."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I remember that to the point of hosting, if you picked one tree and said, that's the one that's keeping them all going. And it really isn't. and,
Yeah.
but over the years of 50, 60 years now, I've been hanging out in the humans behaving in organization world, org
Yeah.
behavior, as you know, you studied
Yeah.
it and I did.
Yeah.
Peter Vale and others got started on it. I've still found and still find the push from
Uh,
maybe the media side of our life to be the hero.
yeah. Sure.
And it kind of is counter to what we know works
Right.
sometime. And in this phase of my life where I brought Peter out and we share our views about practice, I've struggled because the urging, if I want to sell on practice as a way of being,
Yep.
is to become known.
Mm,
Oh, that's Dave Fearon. He's the practice guy. And
mm,
I get that. But the other part of me is when I'm doing these kind of recordings, I want to talk to anyone. I'm happy if it's someone who's got a big famous name or someone who's basically not as well known. I want to sing their praise too. But
mm,
in order to do that, and I'm kind of telling myself to do it right now,
yeah.
I've got to put myself as host
Mm.
and let the guest do more talking.
So yeah, yeah, like good for you, Dave. But I also realized that, and before I lose it, I'll just reference it. Meg's thing was about aspen trees, by the way.
Oh,
It's
but there
the
you go. See,
aspen tree.
I'm from Maine. We didn't, what's an aspen?
Right, there you
Sounds
go.
like a snake.
You got to come out west a little bit,
It
right?
was the aspen,
But it
yes.
was the aspen tree and the, what lives behind that is the notion of people, not just trees and forests, but people as living systems or organizations as living systems. So
Hmm.
that was a key grounding. But Dave, I think you keep pulling out spaces for people to learn. It's one of the ways that I think of you. You and I have known each other or known of each other
Couple
for
of
probably
years.
a
Yeah.
couple years now.
Yeah.
And when I participate in the authors jams with you and the others, I kind of count on you to be a learning filled guy or a curious guy, a kind of playful guy.
Mm-hmm.
And because we're not in a context where we're supposed to dump a bunch of content with each other, that's not even a relevant thing. But
Mm-mm.
I think you can pick up on, an overall sense of who a human being is. And I'll applaud this back to you, Dave. I feel like one of the qualities that I probably most love and appreciate and most, try to develop and live and practice within myself is, can I be a learner? And can
Ah,
I be a learner in every spot that I'm in? And
ah,
sometimes those are crappy spots, and sometimes those are really delightful spots. Sometimes they're complex things, sometimes they're very simple things. You bring a certain orientation to learning, which is as grounding of a desired position as I know.
oh, thank you. Yeah, and I'm telling you, it's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'll add to that, thank God or whatever else. set me up in life to be that way and kept me this way right up to, now and further on.
Beautiful.
Yet, and again, that I think what pulled Peter and me together initially in the 60s when I was a student and all through the years until we collaborated at the end of his life. Peter wrote the book Learning as a Way of Being.
Yeah.
Peter felt deeply as a leader in a college setting and so forth that the job is to create superb learners.
Oh, gosh,
so however you construct the curriculum and do everything else, if people aren't hungry to learn and more confident that they can do it in any challenging situation, then what have you really done?
Yeah.
So that was, that's been my mantra. You have Meg Weekly in your head. I have Peter Vale's philosophy of learning in mine, and mainly because I believe it. And frankly, if I intellectually could not believe it, I would be a content provider. But I see the content that I put in that little chapter in the library and even in the book. I see it as an invitation to learn.
Ooh, nice.
I really do. I remember when you work with the people who edited the Collaborative Change Library, and I remember Carol Golek, who was working on it at the time. I said, Carol, I've been invited to do a chapter, but you've shown me this outline or framework. I can't work with it. Oh. She goes, what? She said, no, I'm not going to provide a methodology and all that. And so I guess I can't be in the Collaborative Change Library. And thank God for Carol. She said, well, how do you want to write it? I said, well, I'd like to pull a story out of my collaboration with Peter. Yeah. And I'd like to show an imaginary conversation with him since he's passed away about a point he made in one of our episodes. Yeah. That practice is a central organizing principle. Right. And so I wrote this little dialogue with Peter. Yeah. And I said, well, I'm going to submit this. You guys can reject it because I did put a method in there. I said, this is a way that you can get people to get themselves into the question by having them have imaginary conversation with great thinkers or people who they respect. Sure. So there it was. The chapter is in there somewhere. But that's the point, that I felt that the chapter would be an invitation. Yeah. And then you can make of it as you will, differently than here are 5 things that you need to do. Dave. Well, that's just me, and I can't do the other thing. Yeah. Unfortunately, I admire anyone who can.
Well, I relate also because in a similar experience, the chapter that I co-authored with Chris Corrigan was on the art of hosting. Oh, and the art of hosting as a body.
Now I have to say I haven't read it, but I must now.
well, but it's a body of work, right? And I remember also. I think appreciating the fact that some consistency of outline and blah, blah, blah would be helpful. But I also remember in me the disgruntlement that I felt like I cannot write that way. So I think Chris and I did our best to sort of, write with what was true and honest for us and to do it in a way that maybe frames up not just the technique, if we go back earlier in our conversation, not just the technique, but the artistry that lives with the technique. Yes. And in this case, a way of being is part of it. I know that's language that you use for this podcast. And
that's right.
Way of being, to me, is woven into all of it,
Yeah. It was, Peter and I discussed whether I would take from his learning as a way of being. And he said, well, how should we retitle this work? And I said, well, how about practice as a way of being? I said, it's totally consistent with the 32 conjectures that we have about what it is when you put your mind and heart and effort into elevating a practice in your life. Beautiful. It becomes a distinction that you have built, not necessarily given to you. Sometimes it's reinforced. But it's an inside-out deal, back to your point of inner outer. Mm. And he said, all right, let's go with it. But I now this will be about maybe 250 episodes by the time this one goes out, airtime with you, Tenneson. But what I feel I can say honestly to you and all the others that I've had, almost 200 people, is it's a portrait, it's a sketch. It's not a caricature that this 30 or 40 minutes is when people listen. But if the conversation works, which this one is, they're going to have a sense of Tenneson Woolf, an intriguing sense. Who is this guy? I want to look him up. I want to find out more.
Fun.
And another sketch of me, but it would not have happened unless it happened in conversation.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And we're pretty good at this. I'd like to keep the camera running a long time, but I know that my listeners, even as we're fascinating two fellows, will say, all right, that's it.
Another 12 hours now.
Yeah, but we started with my saying that I did your podcast, and now you've done mine. How are you feeling at the end of our conversation as we're wrapping this one up? Are you glad we did this? I am.
That's good, Dave. I love the question. And yes, in the short version, I'm glad that I did this. Also,
you can have rage and say no.
no, I'm glad that we got to do this. And to your question, though, it's good, like, to notice, be a noticer about how you feel in the midst of things or at the end of things. And I feel a sense of joy. And I feel a sense of animated learningness, Dave, appreciation of learning. I appreciate, there's a few phrases and words that'll probably dance around with me for a while. You naming artistry and us staying with artistry a little bit. I think all of those things have a way of adding like some courage and some clarity, aliveness. I like to speak of all three of those. Those are such deeply appreciative orientations. And I feel all of those from our conversation. It's a real highlight of the day. I appreciate you, Dave.
Well, I would say more, but I would spoil the good feeling I have in hearing you say that. So thank you. And I look forward to seeing you in the next Authors Jam for the Collaborative Change Library.
Me too, Dave.
Bye. Thank you for listening to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. If you'd like to hear more, go to Automatic, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. And please consider purchasing our book on practice as a way of being at mylibrary.world. It's a digital book with lots of features that you do not see in a conventional book. So once again, thank you, and I look forward to you listening again. Oh, and one more thing. Please